Welcome to iGen and the Inclusion Gap, a presentation by the Office of Multicultural Affairs. Also known as Generation Z, the term iGen refers to people born after 1995. This generation of students tends to be equality and inclusion minded, but does not necessarily have the skills to put these values into practice. This presentation will help you learn to work with these students to develop the skills they need to navigate a diverse world. As a generation that grew up in a society that has experienced major advances in LGBT rights, racial and gender equality, iGeners tend to expect equality and may even be shocked when they experience instances of prejudice. Let's take a look at how this generation of students has experienced the social landscape of diversity and inclusion in their lifetimes. The hypervisibility of success stories surrounding these topics, such as marriage equality, pride, the first Black president, and the increase of women in the workforce, make it much easier for the iGen to centralize the victories of minority groups, rather than the movements and struggles behind them. This perception may lead them to struggle with becoming aware of their own biases, and to have difficulty in navigating conflict around social issues. To illustrate this, let's take a look at what we like to call the Ellen effect. Millennials, the previous generation to iGen, experienced Ellen's coming out as a lesbian quite differently than the following generation. People saw the public backlash for Ellen's coming out, such as the cancellation of her sitcom, and her status as a celebrity made her the face of the LGBT movement at that time. While most millennials were fairly young when Ellen came out, the fact that marriage equality was not passed until their young adulthood gave this generation a point of reference for her struggle and for the events that prompted her becoming a public face of lesbian and gay rights. In contrast, the iGen came of age at a time when Ellen's role in the LGBT rights movement had changed significantly. For them, Ellen is a household name, an incredibly popular talk show host, and humanitarian. Her lesbian identity is essentially a non-issue. While her coming out was a key turning point for millennials, to iGen, it's no longer seen as a central part of her success story. So why do these two generations view Ellen so differently? The first group, millennials, lived through the process of her struggle to exist as a public figure and a visible lesbian woman. By the time iGen was exposed to Ellen, they had missed the obstacles she overcame to gain upward mobility and merely saw her as a successful person who also happens to be gay. Next, we're going to shift gears a bit as we discuss how iGen perceives the fluidity of sexuality and gender. In 2016, 11% of adult Americans reported having bisexual experiences. However, only 4% of Americans identify themselves as LGBT. This may indicate a move away from acceptance of traditional labels around gender and sexuality. The iGen is increasingly open to creating and/or identifying labels for themselves rather than choosing from predefined categories. This generation is also experiencing more instances of trans, non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer, and other gender identities and pronouns. Take a moment to read this quote from non-binary activist Tyler Ford, which speaks to iGen's perspective on gender fluidity. This generation expresses a desire to be their authentic self. As Ford says, iGen is largely rejecting the sense that their identities are placed in a box, which they see as diminishing their personhood. The iGen has grown up in racially diverse environments, and they are used to interacting with individuals of different races. However, they don't think that having a friend of a different race or ethnic background is important, and they say that they don't understand what the issue is around race. The iGen feels that as long as everyone treats each other with respect, race doesn't matter. This theme of ignoring racial issues has important implications for how to address issues of equity and social justice with the iGen. For the iGen, dissonance exists between what they say and feel about issues of diversity and how they act on their supposed values. They support movements on a surface level, but may fail to recognize their biases and effectively support movements. Awareness of social justice issues is important to them, but they don't feel the need to act on these issues. This kind of dissonance is connected to inaction, conformity, and conflict aversion. The iGen is used to being told what to think by social media. By observing public opinions on social movements, iGeners can align themselves with social justice ideals as a way of conforming to popular opinion. They may lack the skills to think critically about the context of movements like Black Lives Matter, and because of their aversion to conflict, particularly around race, members of the iGen rarely engage in meaningful discussions across difference. Additionally, many white iGeners who support these movements do not address their own implicit biases about race, such as a lack of desire for diverse environments, or negative beliefs about the character and intellect of Black folks. The iGen also finds it particularly difficult to empathize with people of different races and genders without a personal connection to individuals from the minority group in question. While LGBT rights are generally accepted by this generation, transgender rights are viewed somewhat differently by the iGen. This generation struggles to reconcile conflicts between their individualist philosophies and the existence of trans people. Some may feel that trans identities are inauthentic, while others may be able to incorporate trans people into their be yourself philosophy. For the iGen, a personal connection to a transgender individual is key to empathizing with the trans community. As we discussed with the Ellen effect and generational changes in the perception of LGBT rights, one might think that the next generation will look at trans rights in the same way that the iGen views marriage equality, having only experienced the victories of the trans movement. Another way we see this phenomenon play out is when students are asked about race. iGeners understand intellectually that people of different races have different experiences, but because they aren't having meaningful conversations about race, they can't truly understand what those experiences are. These statistics demonstrate that the iGen has been raised to believe that race doesn't matter and that it should be ignored. Because their support of social justice movements seems hollow, iGeners may come off as slacktivists. Take a moment to read the definition of slacktivism shown on the slide. At the surface level, this generation of students shows support for social movements, but they may only engage with these movements in ways that make them feel safe, because this requires no or little risk. They haven't developed the skills to seek out next steps in doing social justice work that goes beyond what's safe and comfortable for them. We see this impulse to seek out safety in conversations about free speech. The iGen tends to focus on free speech issues that affect them personally, but they don't necessarily care about free speech as it's defined. Instead, they are more concerned with speech that they feel is inappropriate, speech that makes them and others feel unsafe, uncomfortable, or unwelcome. These statistics demonstrate a few examples of how we know that iGen students are not having critical conversations about race. The final example in particular demonstrates iGen's tendency to avoid conflict around racial issues. At the Office of Multicultural Affairs, we offer multiple ways for iGen students to engage more deeply with racial issues. These include peer mediation, bias incident reporting, and bringing race scholars to campus to speak. Additionally, our student employees are evaluated on their ability to understand and empathize with people of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. Take a moment to look at the graph displayed on the slide, which shows the changes over time in entering college students' attitudes towards free speech. As you can see, more students than ever before are calling for the prohibition of racist and sexist speech on campus, as well as the banning of extreme speakers. The information we've shared so far demonstrates that while iGeners tend to be more progressive than previous generations, we cannot assume that means that they are post-gender or post-racial, or that they have tools to move closer to a more equitable world. It's very easy to look at this information and scoff at what we've learned, but the reality is, it's not right or wrong. It just is. Each generation tends to look at the younger generation in a negative light, but truth be told, students today are more aware about more of the most pressing issues than many of us were at their age, or even right now. This generation has a desire to develop the depth of understanding necessary to create a socially just world. They just don't have the skills to do so yet. In higher education, many of us say challenge and support all the time, but many people have spent more time supporting than challenging students. To wrap up our presentation, take a few minutes to reflect on how you can move beyond simply supporting students and into a place where you can challenge their emphasis on safety and comfort so that they can be empowered to engage seriously with issues of diversity and inclusion. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to OMA by emailing us at multicultural@unca.edu. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on iGen and the inclusion gap.